Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. We have a fascinating and medically important book to discuss today, and it is all about the flu. In 1918, the Great Flu Pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. 100 years later, influenza still kills over 30,000 people annually in the United States, and the disease continues to confound the experts. That is why we're so happy to have with us Dr. Jeremy Brown, who is the director of the Office of Emergency Care Research at the National Institutes of Health in Maryland. So glad you're here, Dr. Brown.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely. We will discuss Dr. Brown's latest book, Influenza, the 100-year hunt to cure the deadliest disease in history. Dr. Brown applies more than 25 years of clinical experience and a deep understanding of health policy. He trained at University College School of Medicine in London and completed his residency in emergency medicine in Boston. He was a director in the Department of Emergency Medicine at George Washington University Hospital before his job at the National Institutes of Health. So Dr. Brown, according to the U.S. Center for Disease Control, last year's flu season, 2018, was the worst in the U.S. since the 1970s. 40 million people got sick. 960,000 were hospitalized and nearly 80,000 died. So we don't know yet what's going to happen with the flu statistics at the end of this season, but what are three of the best ways to avoid the flu?
Well, that's a very important question, isn't it? Because the flu is a seasonal guest, if you like, an unwanted guest. Mm-hmm. And each season we have to think again of what can we do to prevent ourselves from getting sick. Now, sometimes it's really not up to us. As you mentioned, last year was a particularly bad flu season. Mm-hmm. So far as we can tell, in the middle of the flu season of this year, the 2018-2019 flu season, it's relatively mild. So sometimes it's really not up to us, it's up to the virus as to how severe it's going to be. But there still are things, as you mentioned, that we can do. So the first of the three things that I like to think about is what we can do before we are sick.
Right.
And there clearly the only real thing that we can do before we are sick is get vaccinated and stay away from people who are ill. So in terms of the vaccination, we have a vaccine that we have to take every year in order to prevent us from getting sick. It's not a great vaccine. Even in good years, it's only about 50% effective.
Oh, really?
And last year, it was probably no more than 20% effective. So that's not a great vaccine.
No.
And also, you have to take it every year. We can get into the discussion of why that is perhaps later. But the bottom line is that we do have a vaccine. It's only about 50% effective, but that still offers something. Okay. And certainly the people who are at high risk from influenza, those groups include the young children and the elderly, those with chronic medical conditions like perhaps asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, people who have other chronic diseases, people who are immune compromised, so people who have had chemotherapy or on steroids, and finally a very important group, pregnant women. If you're in one of those higher risk groups, you should certainly get a vaccine every year. So that's the first thing we can do, is to get vaccinated and of course to stay away from people who are sick.
Yes.
The second thing we can do is think about it from the point of view of a person who is sick. What can I do to prevent others becoming ill? It's very easy. It's common sense. If you come down with the flu, stay away from others. Don't go into work. If you come down with early symptoms, tell your boss that it's in everyone's interest to stay away from you. Stay home and let the thing pass. And there are other things then the third thing is things that we can all do, and those are hygienic things.
Like wash your hands, right?
Wash your hands.
Yes.
We tell children to wash your hands several times a day in kindergarten, and it really works.
Yes.
Wash your hands. Well, how long should I wash my hands for? I always tell patients, wash your hands and sing happy birthday to you under the sink. Okay, so if you do that several times a day, you don't have to go crazy about it and have cracked and peeled skin.
Right, but
if you do that several times a day and don't cough and sneeze over people, those are the things that we can do as a society to prevent ourselves from getting ill and from avoiding infecting others. But it's still, once we've done that, there's no guarantee, of course, that it's going to
Well, that's exactly right, because according to the Center for Disease Control, only 37% of U.S. adults got vaccinated last year for the flu. And was the vaccine less effective than usual last year, or was the flu season worse because fewer Americans got vaccinated?
It's a good question. The vaccine rate does vary from year to year, but it seems that last year the problem was not so much that Americans weren't being vaccinated in their usual numbers. It was more to do with the fact that there was a mismatch between the strains that were in the vaccine and the strains that ended up actually affecting people and infecting people.
Okay.
And that's what caused the big mismatch.
Okay, good to know. Now, and if you get a flu shot, but it's not the right one, does it offer any help for the flu that you end up getting? And will the shot make you sick?
So let's tackle the second question first.
Okay.
Will the shot make you sick? So there are several kinds of different flu vaccines. One includes what's called a live attenuated vaccine, meaning that the flu virus particle is there, but it's not able to infect you. And others just use what we might call an inactive flu vaccine. None of these can make you sick from influenza, although because the vaccine works by you mounting an immune response to it,
yes,
you may have some of the symptoms of an immune response. So you may feel perhaps sometimes a little bit feverish. There can sometimes be a little ache at the site of the shot. But more than that, the flu vaccine cannot make you sick.
It cannot.
It cannot.
Okay.
Cannot make you sick with influenza. As I said, it can at worst give you a little bit of a local reaction to the fact that your body has now gotten this dose. But it doesn't, that's not a reason to prevent you from getting the illness. What you asked before is, if I get the flu shot, can I still get the flu? And that, of course, is yes, and there are reasons for that. The most likely reason is that although scientists have to sort of predict, based on the best evidence that they have,
right,
and on what happened last year and what happened in the flu season that just passed in Australia during our summer and their winter, they can predict what's likely to be the flu viruses that are circulating, but it's only a good prediction, best prediction. And it can turn out that the viruses that were put into the vaccine,
it's a mismatch.
There's a mismatch. Yes. What was in the vaccine is not what's circulating. Or what can happen is the right viruses were put into the vaccine, but the strains that were out there mutated slightly. And so they became unrecognizable by the immune system. It's a bit like putting a police bulletin out saying, look for a criminal in a brown trench coat, and then the trench coat becomes blue or black. So our immune systems will not pick up a flu type that has mutated a little bit. And so we are always playing catch up against this very sneaky virus.
Yes, well, and then what about, should you get an antiviral medication if you've been exposed to the flu? I mean, what type of antiviral medication should you get?
Right. So when we talk about our response to the flu in somebody who's infected, we can think of a couple of things. The most important thing is supportive care, making sure that person stays in bed and gets hydrated and so on.
Rest, yes.
Rest, hydration, until the thing passes. It is the case that some, unusually and uncommonly, but it does happen, that people get a secondary bacterial infection, a pneumonia often from a flu. Now that requires antibiotics. Influenza does not require antibiotics, right? Because it's a viral infection.
Yes.
And viruses do not respond
to
antibiotics.
Yes.
So we can sometimes give antibiotics in an instant where a patient has come down with a secondary infection.
Yes.
But you asked a question specifically about something to target the flu virus itself. That's not an antibiotic. And those are the class of antivirals. Now, we have a few of them out there on the market. Oseltamivir is the most well-known. It's marketed under the trade name Tamiflu, but there are others. It's a very controversial drug at best.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to do much more than reduce the symptoms on average by about a day.
Okay.
It has not yet been shown to prevent the complications from occurring, those complications we spoke about. And it does also not been shown to reduce the hospitalization rate. So the antiviral medicines that are out there have a very modest effect, if any.
Very good to know.
Certainly you should not be routinely requesting these from your doctor. Your doctor should be the one who, using her best judgment, would advise you whether or not to get an antiviral.
That's excellent information. Now, what should you take once you get the flu? What should you do?
What should you do?
Everyone wants to do something,
Right. And it's interesting, when we think back to the great influenza pandemic of 1918, which is...
And we're going to cover that. We're going to cover that.
Which I sort of focused on in the book a lot. We think about what they had back then, and it was remarkably little. There was all kinds of treatments that were offered back then, including a tree bark, and very often doctors wanted to give their patients enemas. It was a very big thing back then to give patients enemas.
Yes.
Whiskey was very popular.
Yeah, whiskey.
And champagne.
That's right.
But that was 100 years ago. If you look what we have today, we thankfully don't offer people enemas in the emergency department when they come in with their flu. But the number of things that we can really do are very limited, right?
Well, what about aspirin? Do you give them?
So, right, we can give people fluids if they need them, and certainly you should be drinking lots of fluids at home. We can make people comfortable, and we can give them something to reduce the fever. Now, you mentioned aspirin. Aspirin is a good medicine to reduce fevers. Turns out that in 1918, it may well have contributed to many, many of the deaths that we saw. And the reason is that aspirin back in 1918 had recently come off a patent, and it was therefore being used by lots of people. It was getting a little bit cheaper to buy. And people were not clear and certain about how the dosing should be. And it turns out that if you look back at the literature, it was almost certain that people were dosing aspirin in doses that were way too high.
I read that in your book, that people were getting way too many aspirin.
Way too much aspirin, which was actually giving them the symptoms of flu. They were slipping into coma, there was respiratory depression. And it may well have been the case, and some historians have suggested this, that many of the deaths that we saw in the otherwise healthy young people who don't normally succumb to flu, may well have been due to the overdosing of aspirin back in 1918. So we have to be very circumspect. We don't overdose it today.
Well, what do you think contributed to so many deaths in 1918, besides the fact that you didn't have any decent drugs? I mean, was it because people were so close together? I mean, because of the war?
Right. When we think about why was 19 so very deadly, and as you mentioned, 50 to 100 million people died.
A lot.
Worldwide, 675,000 people in the United States. Many
That's
more
huge.
times than the numbers of servicemen killed in the war.
Yes.
250,000 people killed in the UK.
Yes.
20 million in India. I mean, the numbers are staggering.
It is.
So what were the causes? And we think that there are really 4 explanations as to why so many people died then. But, and this is an important thing to note, we're still not absolutely sure.
Okay.
So the first explanation is that this virus prevented our body from mounting an immune response using interferon. Interferon, if you like, is a first-line defense against viruses, viral attacks. And the body couldn't mount this interferon response because somehow the flu virus interfered with it, and that allowed the flu to get a foothold and spread rapidly and do its damage. That's the first thought. The second thought is that it was nothing really to do with the flu virus itself, but it was to do to the secondary bacterial infections that we have discussed. And that the deaths were not really due primarily to the influenza virus, but mostly due to those secondary bacterial infections.
Right.
And the good news there is that...
And they didn't have any antibiotics at
They
that
had
point.
no antibiotics.
Yeah.
Antibiotics were discovered at the beginning of the 1930s.
Right.
And were really only widely available at the beginning of the Second World War. No antibiotics available, and a lot of people died from those secondary bacterial infections.
Yes.
So that's the second explanation. The third explanation is that the virus caused what is called a cytokine storm. So if you think about it, when you cut your finger perhaps and you get a little infection, it gets red, it gets warm, it might be tender, it gets hot, and that is the body mounting a local antibacterial response, right? And it's sending in cytokines, which are these inflammatory mediators, these proteins that attack the bacteria or the virus in the finger, and then everything calms down. Your finger slowly, the redness goes away, it becomes less tender, the swelling goes away. In 1918, what seems to have happened is that the virus caused a cytokine storm, so that these cytokine mediators didn't just attack the lung cells and then go away. They kept attacking the lung cells and kept getting brought in, and you had this sort of uncontrolled immune response. And in many ways, the body was attacking its own lung cells.
Oh my gosh.
And that's called a cytokine storm, and that is thought to have been responsible perhaps for many of the deaths.
Are those storms prevalent in today's medicine? I mean,
we do see them. We do see them, but not in any... We know, first of all, we know a lot more about them. These were not, of course, known back then, and we have ways of interfering with them. But these cytokine storms are thought to have, again, contributed to many of the deaths. And the fourth of the 4 reasons that we're discussing as to why 1918 was so very deadly, the fourth reason is that it was nothing to do with the virus. It was to do with the overcrowding conditions that you mentioned, Louis.
So many people crammed together.
There was a lot more crowding in the early part of the 20th century, and then of course there was the movement of troops into the camps in the United States as they were being staged to move to the fight the World War I
yes.
on the European front,
Yes.
and then in the camps in Europe and on the front lines itself. So there was a lot of movement of soldiers between cities and these military camps where they
Yes.
were being staged.
And they were
from
very
there
close
outwards.
together. Yes, yes.
There are many photographs. You can see one on the front cover of the book there,
Yes.
where people were just put in very, very close
Small,
quarters.
that's right.
And it is thought that it was really that which contributed to
Yes.
making 1918 so deadly in a way that hopefully today we will have learned from,
Yes.
and it wouldn't be repeated today. So those are the 4 reasons that we have, but none of them is completely satisfying as an explanation.
Well, excellent research and wonderfully described in your book. Now, how important is a good night's sleep and taking vitamins in terms of staying healthy and not getting the flu? I mean, do you recommend that? And
well, a good night's sleep is critically important to many parts of our health.
To stay healthy.
Stay healthy.
Yeah.
I mean, I worked many years as shift worker in the emergency department, and we know that working shifts can take as many as 5 years off of your average length of life. On average, I mean, shift workers do pay for this interruption to their circadian rhythm. So getting a good night's sleep is very important for our health in general. Now, that is true, obviously, in terms of influenza as well. But you mentioned vitamins. In the book, I discussed this, but vitamins play an important role in our immune system, particularly vitamin D.
Yeah.
And if we don't have good levels of vitamin D, our immune system is not working at its best.
So we should supplement if we...
Well, hang on.
Okay.
It's a big jump between should we supplement and the role. So we certainly know vitamin D is important. The good news is you really don't need to supplement it if you are living in a place where there is enough sun. So we discussed before we went on camera living north of the Arctic Circle.
Yeah.
It's a problem there. But if you're in a place where there is sunlight, you only need to have your skin exposed for a couple of hours every week, and your body will produce
Enough? Okay.
all the vitamin D that it needs, all other things being equal. So if you want to be extra sure, you might want to take a vitamin supplement, but certainly vitamin D is an important part of our immune system, and we need to make sure that that's available so that we can fight off infection.
Right. Briefly, what has our federal government done to find a cure for the deadliest disease, flu? What has it done?
Well, the good news is that the federal government, really through the National Institutes of Health, is really very focused on figuring out better ways to vaccinate people and looking for perhaps other ways of fighting the disease. So let's focus on those 2 things. So through the National Institutes of Health, and specifically through the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, there are hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on finding what we hoped will be a universal flu vaccine. So we mentioned earlier that every year we take a vaccine, we're given a vaccine that contains 3 or perhaps 4 of the most likely culprits to infect us. That changes from year to year, from season to season, from place to place, right? Different places may be exposed to one type of flu more than another. So we have to get our vaccines updated each year, which is not the case, for instance, for mumps and measles and rubella. We get those as children. We don't take them again. That's because those viruses don't mutate, right? The flu virus mutates so quickly. So what the National Institutes of Health is very focused on is finding a universal flu vaccine, a vaccine that would target not the bits of the flu that change, but the bits of the flu virus that are constant from year to year.
Okay.
And if we can target those constant bits of the flu virus and teach our immune systems to fight that, then we won't have to get the vaccine updated every year.
Interesting.
And so millions of dollars are being spent on trying to find a universal flu vaccine.
Okay.
And the good news is that early trials are underway at the National Institutes of Health and also in the United Kingdom through their own National Institutes of Health research to find a vaccine that would not need to be repeated from year to year.
Well, that's very positive.
It is positive. Along with that, there are research efforts, mostly from pharmaceutical companies, to find better drugs to target the flu virus itself and so
Right.
that you could give those when people became
Well,
sick.
I just have to say, in reading your book, on page 169, you wrote that Washington, D.C. is crawling with lobbyists. There are 11,000 of them in 2016, with $3.1 billion to ply lawmakers in the federal government with the goal of supporting rules and regulations that are friendly to the business. And the industry that spends the largest amount of money for lobbying then and today is not the defense industry or the energy sector. It's healthcare.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, care to elaborate on that fact from your book?
Right. Well, yes, healthcare is the industry that spends the most amount of money lobbying each year, probably twice as much as its nearest competitor. You have to pause and say to yourself, well, is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Yes.
In our society, we believe that access to government through lobbyists is an important part of our national discourse. And if you think about it, in terms of what's happened recently, lobbying is extremely important. When HIV was discovered in 1980-81, it was a neglected, it was unknown disease, and for a while it was seen as a disease that only affected a certain, somewhat stigmatized, very stigmatized members of society. And because of the important lobbying, excuse me, the important lobbying that members of society, right, members of society as a whole, and AIDS activists in particular did, because of their lobbying, government attention was focused on a disease that could otherwise have been neglected. And as a result of that, actually at its peak, NIH was spending 10% of its budget on HIV research as a result of this lobbying. And almost certainly, as a result of those dollars, we discovered the antiviral drugs that we have today that have made HIV go from a deadly disease, certainly that's what it was like when I started practicing, go from a deadly disease to a disease as a chronic disease that, all other things being equal, so long as you take your drugs, every day you will live a long and healthy life, even being infected with HIV.
That's true. That's
so
true.
we don't want to think that lobbying doesn't have its benefits.
That's right.
It certainly does. But we also have to be circumspect and realize that lobbyists have an interest at heart, and that interest is often a financial interest.
Yes.
And so I discuss that deeply in the book, and I think that's something that we should all recognize, especially when we look at ads on TV that sell us these drugs.
Exactly. And of course, in the prologue of your book, Influenza, was very dramatic. A 31-year-old woman named Autumn, who was in great shape, and she gets a cold and she becomes extremely sick quickly. The antibiotics don't work and she can't breathe on her own. Tell us how the emergency doctors saved her life.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story, isn't it? That
It
I
is.
open with in the prologue. Autumn and her family were very, very kind to me, and really I spent a lot of time talking with them and piecing this back together, together with the physicians who really saved her life.
Because she came down with the flu very quickly.
Yes, essentially she was a young, healthy mother of two who went to the gym and went out to eat with a friend around Christmas time, went home and was texting with this friend, and the friend realized that her texts were making no sense. And the friend went over and found her to be confused, right? So this was between dinner and sort of later in the evening. And the friend knew she'd not been drinking alcohol because they were together at dinner.
Yes.
Took her to the emergency department, where essentially most of her tests were normal. She had a clear x-ray, she had a rapid test for influenza that was negative. But the doctors very, very, very keenly observed that there was something just didn't feel right. You know, you have that sense when you're a well-trained physician. Something isn't right. They admitted her for observation, and by the morning time, she had become critically ill. She needed a breathing tube. In a matter of hours, she decompensated, had to be flown to Pittsburgh, where she was taken immediately to the intensive care unit, where she was put on heart bypass surgery. So basically, her lungs were failing, her heart was failing. She was put on a heart-lung bypass, her heart stopped.
It's a miracle she survived.
It is an absolute miracle of modern medicine that she survived. She would have been dead just a few decades earlier. She pulled through thanks to the brilliant work of her physicians and nurses and respiratory therapists, thanks to the support of her family and community.
But are there many cases like Autumn how badly Autumn was affected? Are there many cases like that in your hospital?
Yes, so she is clearly an outlier. The vast majority of people with flu will not be anywhere near as sick as she will be. But we do, on aggregate, see patients like this. It's very unusual, but when you talk to a physician whose only job is to be in the intensive care unit, taking care of patients like this, he or she will tell you that they may see several of these each year, depending exactly on where they're located.
Well, just real briefly, what are the major symptoms if you have the flu? What are the symptoms?
Yeah. So the flu, when it hits us, it's very simple. I mean, you come down with fevers and chills very rapidly.
Okay.
I remember having the flu and I felt fine 1 minute, walking down the hall in my house. By the time I got to the end of the corridor, I felt awful. I mean, it comes on as quickly as that.
Okay.
So it's a fairly rapid onset of fevers and chills and body aches. You can get sweats. Sometimes you can have vomiting, diarrhea, and a cough. And those body aches are really sort of characteristic of it. Those are really the symptoms that you will feel when you come down with influenza. In
1918, we reacted, we did not prepare, but today we're much better at preparing for disasters. So what is the chance that today we would have a pandemic, and what would happen? I mean, do we have a plan? Do we have a pandemic plan?
Yes. So let me take that second question first. So do we have a pandemic plan? The good news is that really since 2009, but perhaps before that, that was the swine flu epidemic of 2009, but sometime before that too, we have really as a nation and at the state level as well been focused on preparing for pandemic flu. Now, many people will tell you that preparation is not enough, but it is at least going on. So there is a federal pandemic flu plan that you can find online. It's publicly available.
Wonderful.
And each state makes its own pandemic flu preparations, as well as thinking about where the sick people would be looked after, where mildly sick people would be looked after. So there certainly has been a lot of effort put into pandemic flu preparation. The problem is that we thankfully haven't had a really bad flu epidemic for some time, and that means that the flu preparation goes out of the consciousness. Funds are diverted away from pandemic flu preparation to something more pressing. And so the further out we are from a bad outbreak, the less our focus is on preparing for such an outbreak.
Right. But most likely the outbreak would be in the fall and winter because the flu doesn't seem to hit in the summer.
That's right.
Why is that?
Well, flu is a seasonal disease, as you mentioned, and there has been a lot of work trying to figure out why it doesn't strike, as you said, in the summer. We believe that it is because flu likes a cold, dry atmosphere.
Okay.
And so if you have a high humidity, you are less likely to be able to transmit the flu. And flu also likes a cold environment. That's part of the answer. It's not the whole answer. People have suggested perhaps it's something to do with crowded conditions, but that doesn't seem to be a satisfactory answer. For example, we know that kids come back to school at the end of the summer, but where they're crowded, they don't seem to get the flu until the fall and the winter time like the rest of us. So it's not just because of crowded conditions. We all pretty much live in our offices and our work environments year round. Perhaps in the summertime we'll go out to have a lunch break in the courtyard, but otherwise we're there. And so the suggestion that there's something about crowding, that we crowd more in the winter as opposed to the summer, it doesn't seem to really be the case. So flu likes a cold, dry environment, so that means that it doesn't really like the summertime.
Okay.
But we're still trying to figure out why it's so cyclical.
Well, I have to say, I wish we had more time to discuss your book. Unfortunately, our time is coming to an end, and I'd just like to ask you, where can our viewers find your wonderful book?
Well, thank you. The book is certainly available at local booksellers. Online, at certain online booksellers will certainly have it. Amazon, I know, carries it, and so it's very easily available, and I do hope your readers will enjoy it.
And Dr. Brown, thank you so much for being a guest on the Bookman's Corner. It's been delightful to have you here.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.